Artificial leather is a man-made material designed and manufactured to look like natural leather. It's often made from plastics and available in a variety of textures, finishes, colors, patterns, and even, smells. Artificial leather is most commonly used in upholstery, clothing, footwear, bags, and costs anywhere from around $1 to $5 per square foot. So what's it really made from? So artificial leather is produced primarily from plastics and polymers. And so we do see more and more, leather alternatives being created today from, natural fibers like pineapple leather and grapeseed leather and cactus leather. So we're seeing more and more of that. So there are some artificial leathers that have natural components, although usually some of those also have, other polyurethane or polyester or kind of elements to it. So in terms of artificial leather, for most of what we've seen until recent times, it has been plastic, petroleum-based materials that are crafted to look like natural leather. And so sometimes they're called faux leather, synthetic leather, vegan leather, but the reality is none of them are leather. It's simply, just a different material that is being referred to as leather to help kind of bring attention to it since it's made to look like leather. So it's important to know that distinction because some people will get confused and says, oh, I have vegan leather. What it really is plastic. And that can be okay depending on the application. It's just important from an educational standpoint to know the difference in that, none of these are natural leathers at all. They're just different materials. So knowing that, let's explore some of the aspects of these that can be great and some things that you may be familiar with and a little more about what artificial leather really is. Since it's man-made, artificial leather can be produced with an array of characteristics and options to meet pretty much any preference. These can be stylistic, such as the look and the feel and the texture and the surface coatings. It could also be functional. What kinds of elements are included in there to be water resistant, scratch resistant, even have different scents applied. So it smells like a natural leather, it smells like something else. And there's a lot of variation in there. And so because of that, there's way more customization that can be applied to an artificial leather than a natural leather. Also, since this is an artificial material, it can be made in really large sizes. Whereas natural leather is kind of constricted to the size of the hide, these artificial leathers can be made in huge rolls or sheets or pretty much any size that you can create the manufacturing equipment to make, this can be made. And so as such, it makes it really cost effective and also suitable for a lot of goods and materials that require a larger, originating material size. And then on top of that, some of these can even be produced on top of fiber backings. And that way you have a very flexible material that can behave very much, like a natural leather or even any type of a, natural fabric as well. When considering this, like most plastics, they're going to break down over time, often sometimes over a few years, or if they're exposed to any kind of like a UV light or things like that, they may, discolor or dry out and crack. And so that's something to keep in mind as well, is that these are going to last maybe only a few years, versus a natural leather, which may have, decades or centuries if well maintained. That said, there may be some use cases where these are some better options. And these could include things like public transportation upholstery, where you're looking for material that you want to look good, not stain easily, and also be relatively inexpensive. And so for that, this is a great material. Also for, some kind of boating and outdoor upholstery, where it'll be out in the environment, maybe in the rain. You want a material like this that will stand up to that and be durable and perform well and look good while it's being used. So let's take a brief look into the history of some artificial leathers. And if we go back in time a little bit, we'll see around in the 1800s, we have a material called pressed off. And this is a synthetic leather that was made from tree pulp and was developed in Germany and used pretty often in World War II. In 1914, we have a material called naugahyde, and that was developed in Naugatuck, Connecticut. And this was used primarily for upholstery and things like that, and was relatively known into the mid-1900s. In 1915, we see a material called fabricoid. This was a pyroxylin jelly kind of cloth-based material developed by DuPont. And it was used primarily, for products that would mirror the look and feel of leather goods at that time. In 1926, a really big one comes along, and this is polyvinyl chloride, or is what we know as PVC. And this is commonly used for PVC pipes, although this material became popular for use in personal leather items or personal items that would mirror the look and feel of leather goods, for a really long time. And then in 1963, we see a material called Corfam. And this is a porometric leather developed by DuPont. It's essentially a shiny, smooth leather used often in footwear at that time. And it lasted with interest for around a decade or so. Once we see the 70s come around, we see a lot more variation in terms of material availability, production processes, and a lot more synthetic leathers that are out there. Even to the kinds of patent leathers today. Some are actually, natural leather, with that vinyl surface applied. Some are purely just, synthetic leathers throughout. And there's a huge amount of synthetic leather available today, artificial leather options with all kinds of production processes, pretty much in any color, texture, thickness, and style you can imagine. So here we have a zoomed in view of the top of artificial leather. And you could see here a really, really consistent texture pattern to it. Normally I'd say grain pattern if we're looking at leather, but since this is not leather, fibers, there's really no grain pattern on the top. This is just the material texture that was applied to it. Even then, being really zoomed in, you could see it's a very tight, smooth pattern. You can imagine, pulling out from looking at it, it's going to look even more consistent the further away we get. Looking at the bottom, we also see an impressively consistent pattern there as well. Whereas in natural leathers, we're going to see a lot more open fibers and variability in kind of how they look. Here we've got a really consistent, indicative of like man-made, manufactured material pattern to that bottom part there. Interestingly, it is a little more open on the bottom than it is on the top, which does mirror natural leather. Yet here, it's still a man-made material, and it looks relatively really smooth and dense. And here, looking at the cross-section, it becomes widely apparent what this material is. So here we've got essentially a very consistent density, internal structure that runs throughout. And this is because it is a man-made material. And so it is poured and essentially is going to be, you guessed it, it is consistent throughout. It's that same material. We do see kind of that top layer, we do see the bottom layer. Those can each be pressed in different ways during the manufacturing process to look pretty much however the manufacturer would like. And but it's really cool to take a look and see like what this looks like. In a natural leather, you would see definitely different layers of fibers as you went from the top down to the bottom, and there would be a lot of variation in that. Where here, it's straight through consistent, and that's one characteristic of some artificial leathers. Looking at the production process for artificial leather, there's going to be around 4 main parts to it. The first one involves mixing. So here's where the plastic-based composition is kind of mixed together. This is going to form the main mixture. And even in leathers like apple leather, things like that, where there is some polyurethane component, it's all mixing in this beginning part. And this is going to produce a very thick, kind of liquid textured mixture. And there could be all kinds of additives mixed in to give it UV protective properties or reflective or flame retardant properties. Pretty much anything you want can go in at this step, as well as any kind of pigmentation. So we can do colorings and things like that, all go into the mix. And most often in artificial leather, we're going to see the plastics used being polyurethane, also called PU, or polyvinyl chloride, also called PVC, and also commonly called vinyl. All right, the next step is extrusion. So once we have that liquid mixture together, it is then extruded onto a flat backing. This way it has support once it dries. This can be poured on using gravity, or it can be pushed on using a machine mechanism. But essentially, this can be extruded too onto a fiber backing that will remain with the material, or just a basically a machine backing that will allow it to dry, but then the material lifted and it has no backing in the finished look. Often we're going to see it on some type of a fabric backing, and this provides critical support as because once the material dries and adheres to it, this can become very flexible later on. And this will mirror kind of the performance of some fabrics, of some leathers, and that can be a great thing depending on what its end use is going to be. These backings are often going to be some type of a fiber, but sometimes they're going to be a metal, a plastic, or other type of mesh surface that provides a gripping area for that mixture to adhere to. In some cases, this drying process can be sped up to save time and costs where heat is applied, or it can just be air dried depending on what that particular process uses in its steps. The next step is the stamping, embossing, or printing step. So now we have a material that usually has a backing, or it may not, and we want it to, often look like leather, right? Since this is an artificial leather, we want to get it as close to that leather look and feel as can be. And so in this process, the leather can be stamped. It can be given a grain pattern, it can be given a design pattern, a texture, anything like that. And it's usually done either with large metal plates that are reverse etched with that stamp, and that way when you press it into the leather, it results in the design of that showing in the leather, or it can be huge rollers, and the leather material is fed through those rollers, and then those rollers are etched with that pattern, and that leaves it in the finished material. Also in this step, if there are going to be additional surface colorings or things like that, they might be applied here. This can be done to give surfaces like a vintage or antique look, or any other type of a logo or branding applied at this stage is typically when that'll happen. And then finally, we have our finishing stage. After the material has been prepped and created and stamped, typically a coating will be applied as a protectant. And this can be done as a UV protectant, scratch resistance, fire retardant. It could help keep in like a layer above any kind of logos or embossing to help protect that. But essentially it's going to make it more durable, less susceptible to water, and basically help it keep its look and feel for a little bit longer. And once the finishing surfaces are applied, the artificial leather is done and ready for use. Looking at costs of artificial leather, it ranges anywhere around $1 to $5 per square foot. And there's it can be even larger, right? You can get more expensive ones, less expensive ones. This is because artificial leather is a very broad term for a lot of synthetic materials. And there are a lot of synthetic materials out there. So for the context of this, just know that it's relatively less expensive in most cases than a natural leather. There's a lot of factors that can go into what this material costs, including the material itself, the production process, the thickness, the type of finish, what texture it is, if there's any association, in style and look and feel to popular brands that are out there, how well it mirrors the look and feel of natural leather, if there are any, scents and smells applied to it, all kinds of things. So super wide range, but in general, it's going to be less expensive than a natural leather. Some pros are that it can be a little more sustainable, given the ratio of what type of natural products are used versus synthetic ones. Another one is that it's very cost effective when compared to natural leather. It's also very easy to maintain. Often it is water resistant, scratch resistant, and really easy to clean. Additionally, it's really versatile. You could make anything you'd make with a natural leather, you could pretty much make with an artificial leather. So there's a lot of applications for it, in crafting. Some cons is that it may not be as environmentally friendly or sustainable as it may seem, because a lot of artificial leathers are made using, petroleum-based products and plastics and things like that. And so while it may be less expensive, there may be some other factors to consider there as well. Also, it's not as durable as natural leather. Typically, these plastic-based materials will begin to wear down, or discolor within a few years, where natural leather can last, if well maintained, for decades and, even centuries, in the right uses. Artificial leather is usually less breathable as well, given that it's a synthetic material. It's not going to have the same breathability, as a natural leather. And there's also limited repairability. Because they're often plastic-based materials, they're going to have a different kind of repair approach. And sometimes if the materials are worn or dried or cracked too much, it really may not be repairable. So something to keep in mind as well. Some great uses for artificial leather include, pretty much anything. You've got clothes and shoes and bags and accessories and, automobile interiors, cases, covers, athletic equipment, home decor, furniture. So it's a wide variety of things, and you've probably seen this type of leather used, in a lot of places. I'd say some of the places where it really shines are going to be, again, in public transport upholstery, things, like trains and, airport terminals, and things like boating upholstery as well, where you're going to be outdoor, exposed to moisture. That's where these can be great because they are less expensive than a natural leather, which means that they can, be obtained and used more widely. They can be replaced less expensively, and they're also generally pretty water resistant, in some cases potentially waterproof. So they're going to be an ideal thing to use in those kinds of outdoor or high traffic applications. A few tips for working with artificial leather. Know your leather, or know your material in this case, right? Because it's not really leather. Know its abilities and how it may translate a little differently than natural leather into a finished good. And also, too, know how your tools may respond to an artificial leather a little differently than a natural leather. You may find that, using chisels or irons are going to respond a little differently. How your stitching sits and rests may be a little differently. So basically, since there are so many types of artificial leather, just get an idea of what you're going to be using and then practice with it to make sure that the techniques that you are familiar with will translate well into this different material, or you can learn how to adapt them effectively into this material to get a good result. So there you have it, a look at the artificial leather. They are everywhere, so many. There are some great ones. Just keep in mind that they are primarily plastic based, so not a true leather. However, they are an alternative material that in some ways can simulate the look and feel of natural leather, and depending on the project, can be a great option that can get you some excellent results.